All right, let's dive into a really important chapter from Morgan Housel's The Psychology of Money. This one's all about two of the most powerful and, most invisible forces in our financial lives, luck and risk. We're always told that success is just about hard work and smart choices, right? But what if that's only half the story?
What's the real difference between a billionaire and a tragedy? Well, sometimes it's nothing more than a 1 in a million chance. And to really get our heads around this fine line between incredible fortune and just devastating misfortune, we need to start with a story.
And this isn't just any story. It's about two incredibly brilliant high school friends. Both seem destined for greatness, but their lives shot off in completely different directions, all because of forces way, way outside of their control.
So meet Bill Gates and Kent Evans. Back when they were teenagers at a place called Lakeside School, their paths looked pretty much identical. They were both computer geniuses, both super ambitious, and they had these big plans to conquer the world together. On paper, they were the same guy, with the same skills and the same drive.
Okay, so here's where things take a wild turn. Bill Gates' high school, Lakeside, had a computer. We're talking 1968, a time when most universities didn't have a computer, let alone a high school. This wasn't just a small leg up. It was an absolutely extraordinary, almost unbelievable stroke of pure luck for a 13-year-old kid.
I mean, the odds of this are just staggering. The chance of any high school student on the planet having access to that kind of tech in 1968 was literally 1 in a million. Gates himself has said that if it weren't for Lakeside, there would be no Microsoft. Plain and simple. This was his head start, and it was delivered by pure chance.
And right there alongside him was Kent Evans. Everyone, including Bill Gates, said Kent was his equal, just as brilliant. They spent hours and hours scheming, planning their futures as CEOs or generals. Kent wasn't just a buddy, he was going to be a partner. He was on the exact same rocket ship.
And this is where the story flips from unbelievable fortune to absolute tragedy. Kent Evans died in a mountaineering accident before he even graduated high school. The odds of that happening? Also about 1 in a million. It's the same invisible force, the same 1 in a million magnitude, just pointing in the opposite direction. Bill Gates experienced a 1 in a million dose of luck. Kent Evans got hit with a 1 in a million dose of risk.
This story just perfectly captures the main idea of this chapter. See, luck and risk aren't two different things. They are two sides of the very same coin. They're siblings.
So the really crucial point here is that we are not in 100% control of our outcomes. Not even close. The world is just way too complex. Your individual effort is just one tiny variable in this massive equation that has billions of other people and infinite moving parts. Luck and risk, well, that's just what we call the influence of all those other parts.
And hey, this isn't some fringe idea. When the Nobel Prize-winning economist Robert Shiller was asked what he most wanted to understand about investing, this was his answer. Even the absolute experts admit how powerful and mysterious this force is. But, because it's so hard to measure, a lot of the time, we just pretend it doesn't exist.
So, if luck and risk are so incredibly powerful, why are we so bad at seeing them? Well, the answer is all in our heads. Our brains are basically wired to look for simple, neat and tidy stories to explain everything.
Think about it, right? When we see someone else fail, our first thought is often, wow, they must have made some bad decisions. But when we fail, oh, it's because of bad luck, of course. We just love these simple cause and effect stories because the reality that messy, random chance plays a huge role is kind of uncomfortable.
And this gets to one of the biggest problems with all of this. The line between calling a decision bold and calling it reckless is usually something you can only see in the rearview mirror. The exact same move can be called visionary if it works or totally foolish if it fails.
Just look at someone like Cornelius Vanderbilt. He openly broke the law to build his railroad empire. But since he succeeded, history often paints him as this bold visionary. A guy who just wouldn't let anything stand in his way.
But what about other people who break the rules? John D. Rockefeller was called a common thief by a judge for doing similar stuff. The executives at Enron went to prison. The line between being a genius and a criminal often just comes down to whether you got away with it, whether luck happened to be on your side. So, if we can't really trust the stories of specific people because they're so skewed by luck, then what are we supposed to do? How should we think about success and failure? Well, it means we need a whole new way of looking at things, one that focuses on broad patterns, not on specific people.
The first rule is you've got to stop obsessing over the extreme outliers.
When we study billionaires or these huge catastrophic failures, we're looking at the most extreme outcomes possible. And the more extreme the outcome, the more likely it was powered by an extreme dose of luck or risk. Trying to copy that is like trying to win the lottery twice. The key ingredients just aren't repeatable.
A much better approach is to look for broad, common patterns. So instead of trying to be the next Warren Buffett, look for the general principles that lots of successful people use. Things like patience, being disciplined, having a long-term mindset. Those are the lessons you can actually take and use in your own life.
So here's the framework to take with you. First, be careful who you praise and admire. Realize that not all success comes from just hard work. Second, be careful who you look down on. Not all poverty is because of laziness. And finally, focus your energy on learning from broad, actionable patterns, not the wild stories of the extreme outliers.
So where does all this leave us? Well, it all points toward a much humbler and more realistic way of looking at money, and really at life itself. It's about acknowledging the role of chance, with some humility when you win, and some forgiveness when you fail.
Bill Gates himself said it perfectly. When you're successful, it's so easy to feel like you're invincible, that you can't lose. But that's the exact moment you have to remember the luck that got you there. Because if you acknowledge that luck played a part, you also have to acknowledge that its sibling, risk, could take it all away just as fast.
And you know what? The opposite's true too. Failure can be a lousy teacher. It can trick you into thinking a perfectly good decision was actually a terrible one. But sometimes you can do everything right and still lose. That's not a sign you made a mistake. That's just what risk is. The key is to set up your finances so you can take those hits and still stay in the game.
And that brings us to the single most important lesson from this entire chapter, the one thing to remember. Nothing is ever as good or as bad as it seems. When you're on top of the world, remember, you're not a genius, you got a little lucky. And when you're at the bottom, remember, you're not an idiot, you were just on the receiving end of risk. Keeping that in mind gives you a much more balanced and, frankly, a more accurate view of how the world really works.